Welcome everybody to the Parkland Institute conference to think about building the world that we want. And I can't wait for this session and thinking about how we're going to bring some energy to this Saturday and thinking about energizing the conversations, but also having some really thought-provoking and disrupting conversations about some troubling questions that we have to ponder. I know that Paul is going to be building off of the conversations that have already been happening today, thinking about climate change, thinking about the legacy that we're currently building, currently leaving behind for our future generations. But I'm going to get us started in a good way today by offering a land acknowledgement. We'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that we are currently located on Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwaciy-Waskagan, Beaver Hills House in the Plains Cree language. Treaty 6 has been a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous people such as the Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Inuit, but particularly the Cree, who have stewarded this land we are on since time immemorial. Their stories and culture continue to shape our relationship to each other and this land. Amiskwaciy-Waskagan has always been a gathering place, and today we're gathered here to respectfully learn from one another and celebrate the learning that occurs in this place. Treaty acknowledgements are a response to a call to action that is sounded across Turtle Island to recognize treaty rights and responsibilities. In doing so, we also acknowledge our obligations and commitments to care for the land and for each other. It is through these acts of care that we will heal, innovate, learn, and grow together. It's with great respect and gratitude that I acknowledge the original caretakers of this land. I still have so much to learn about this place and my relationship to it, but I'm grateful to those who have safeguarded these sacred spaces and nurtured the land so that I might have that chance. Today, I'm honored to acknowledge Treaty 6 territory in this gathering place because I am, like we all are, bound to this treaty for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the waters flow. The responsibility lies upon all of us to uphold what was promised. Hi, hi. So now it's my great honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Kershaw, and he's going to be speaking about Alberta needs to fix its generation deal. Dr. Paul Kershaw is a tenured professor at the University of British Columbia, public speaker, regular media contributor, and founder of Generation Squeeze. Generation Squeeze is a think and change tank promoting well-being for all generations by championing generational fairness to preserve what Canadians hold sacred, a healthy childhood, home, and planet. Kershaw received a UBC's President's Award for Public Education through Media in 2023, the Award for Academic of the Year in 2016 from the Confederation of University Faculty Associations of BC. He's like, bring it on, bring it on. And twice the Canadian Political Science Association has honored Kershaw with national prizes for his gender and politics research. So not only is he humble, he's received the award for BC's Affordable Housing Champion in 2017, the Government of Canada's Award for Excellence in Moving Knowledge to Action on Housing in 2018. His work has directly influenced many policy areas, including the $10 a day childcare, the National Housing Strategy, pollution pricing, taxation of housing wealth, and commitments to generational fairness. Kershaw is the director of Masters of Public Health program at the UBC School of Population and Public Health. Please welcome Dr. Kershaw.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I think it's only my mother who really is interested in the bio, and she takes great pride. What world do we want? I want a world that does have a better generational deal. I will unpack that over my next 40 minutes with you. But at bottom, I think it means that we are leaving a legacy of which we can all be proud. I think Courtney's plenary really focused in no small part about what kind of climate legacy are, and it is perhaps the most essential intergenerational issue of which to talk. I'm going to spread that thinking, though, today to talk about issues regarding housing, the use of tax dollars, and sort of our broader commitments to legacy. I want to add to the land acknowledgement, first acknowledging that I am presenting here on Treaty 6 territory, and I want to let you know that I come from Katzie territory, the ancestral unceded territory of the Katzie people at the confluence of the Pitt and Fraser rivers. Colonized maps describe that as Pitt Meadows, British Columbia, which is part of Metro Vancouver. And my personal story is very enmeshed in that space. You will hear soon that I am a homeowner. I've been a homeowner now for almost 20 years on unceded land in the region where home values have gone up more than anywhere else in this country. I have gained $1.5 million in my home while I slept. So clearly my personal story, my personal security is deeply implicated in the harmful legacy of colonization and forces me to have to think deeply about what are my responsibilities to promote truth and reconciliation and decolonization work. And I encourage all of us to think deeply about the responsibilities that we have. You've heard we are a think and change tank. Our think part happens largely at the University of British Columbia, where we have a lab. We're much like the Parkland Institute, and we have a charity called the Association for Generational Equity. Together, we are trying to bring the best evidence into the world of public policy to promote well-being for all generations, and we do that by championing the concept of generational fairness. And we aim to protect things that we do hold to be sacred in this country. The Bible already referred to, like a healthy childhood, the idea that the dream that a good home could be in reach for what hard work can earn, the way in which we use our precious tax dollars. These are all things that are, our sacred trust, and that implies that we have responsibilities of stewardship. Our vision is a Canada that works for all generations. And this speaks towards different life course stages. For those who are wiser and older in the room, it's about that grandparental stage, about what are we leaving behind. I think everyone wants to leave a better life for our kids and grandchildren. But I'm going to show you data that makes clear we are leaving a broken housing system, we are leaving large unpaid bills at government levels, and we're leaving extreme weather that is just frightening. And then for those that we so dearly love who are younger than me now, we desperately need to address the real risks that there are multiple generations of young people who are increasingly socialized to think that they're failing because their earnings cannot keep pace with the major cost of living, and then they tend to individualize as, what am I doing wrong? But the reality is that at a systemic level, younger generations' financial circumstances are being hammered by home prices that are leaving their earnings behind, all while they do inherit larger government debts and frightening amounts of environmental damage. The result is that hard work does not pay off like it used to. Hard work does not pay off like it did for previous generations. This gives rise to greater levels of economic precarity for young people, rising levels of mental ill health, eco-anxiety, as Courtney was referring to so eloquently earlier today. And what makes me most worried, declining levels of hope for the future. So that is what we need to be turning around. The world that I want does not have that. And I suspect there are many in the room who will join in that common cause with me. Now, when we talk about intergenerational fairness, most of the people who come to us because they've experienced or seen a symptom of what we describe as intergenerational unfairness. Symptoms like housing is unaffordable, or we're not investing enough in the generation raising young kids, or climate change, weird approach to promoting health in this country, or our budgets at federal and provincial levels have some serious intergenerational tensions. Because we are a solutions-oriented organization that loves to get into the weeds of public policy details, we've got solutions to address each of those symptoms. And I am going to give you a scan of the maps that can help us climb to the ascent to get to vanquishing the problems of unaffordability and get us to a place where there is enough. Whether that's housing, or in regards to climate change, or for family issues. I will invite us to think provocatively. I don't know how this is going to sit with tomorrow morning's session on the crisis in medical care, but I'm going to do a bit of a reframing on that a little bit this afternoon. And so I'm going to let us have a policy conversation. But my punchline really is that our ability to climb these mountains to solve the symptoms of intergenerational unfairness require that we begin our ascent with a stronger foundation. And that stronger foundation has to be one that not only commits us to address inequalities, systemic inequalities like classism and sexism and racism, and add to that we have a broken intergenerational system, and that we need to take that systemic lens as well. And as you're trying to think through, what does it mean to have, a commitment to generational fairness? You can go and read some great books going back to a range of philosophers over time, but I think it can be boiled down to the following three simple principles. Are we planning wisely for all ages? Are we investing in well-being from the early years onward? Are we committing to being good ancestors? Are we stewarding these things that I've described as sacred, like a healthy childhood and home and planet and retirement? And if we do, then we will be fulfilling the intergenerational golden rule. Do unto other generations as you would have them do unto you. As I go very quickly over these maps to ascend to the places we wish to rise toward, you can find many more details at these websites for anyone who's going to be watching later on in a video. These websites will take you to many more details. I will draw your attention that Gen Squeeze is deeply interested in Alberta. We're not based here, but every year we do a more detailed analysis of your annual budget than do most other groups. And actually, I think we probably developed one of the most, if not the most, detailed analysis of the election platforms from the two major parties and what they put on offer in the most recent election. And so I'll be drawing on observations from those sources a lot today. Let me begin diving more deeply today in terms of housing. This is actually not the best line graph I'm looking at right now, but I want you to pay attention to you can see the blue line and the orange line, the light blue line and the orange line. And you'll see that over time, the lines started in the mid-1970s. This is when the majority of baby boomers were coming of age as young adults. And then it moves more towards the contemporary period. These lines are summarizing the Alberta experience. And you'll see that over time, that blue line is leaving the orange line further behind. And what that means is home prices are getting more and more expensive by comparison with what full-time work pays for a typical young adult aged 25 to 34. So that back in the mid-1970s, the typical young adult would have had to work about 5 to 6 years to save a 20% down payment on an average-priced home in this province. And if you flash forward to today in Alberta, it's now a year or so out of date, it's 9 to 10 years. The same goes for Edmonton. Calgary, even a little bit more expensive. And so one of the things you're seeing is that it takes years more of hard work to try and save a down payment. That's causing younger people and newcomers of any age to be out of ownership for longer periods. They're having to be renters more of them competing for available rental, not a lot of that always around. Rents have been on the rise, and over an annual period, renters will be paying thousands more in rent as they're trying to think about how to save, if they wish to get into home ownership. As a non-local, I will confess, as a British Columbian, I was absolutely dumbfounded during the May 2023 election here that the party that won power had 27 policy priorities on its election campaign website, and not one of them was housing. If you live in BC or Ontario, you can't go anywhere without someone saying the first thing out of their mouth is like, what do you think about this housing situation? There is not a political party that could run in either of those provinces that didn't have housing at the front and center of what it was campaigning on. And yet you were in a political context where that was not what was front and center. The NDP party did have a little bit more on housing, in particular talking about how can we scale up non-market housing to address issues of homelessness. This is a typical kind of leftist center NDP issue, doing it relatively well, not with enough money, but still more than the incumbent party. But not a really sophisticated conversation about housing. And I don't mean that in a way like, you're not a sophisticated population. I'm just like, the narrative here isn't what it is in a couple of other provinces. And I suspect that's because, let me show you what average home prices are like on average in this country. Whereas it takes 10 years to save a 20% down payment on an average priced home now in Alberta, it takes 17 years on average from coast to coast. That is driven disproportionately by the fact that it takes 22 years in British Columbia, and regrettably, following the pandemic, Ontario caught up. And then in the epicenters of housing insanity, in Metro Vancouver, it takes 27 years of full-time work to save a 20% down payment on an average-priced home. And now so it does in the Greater Toronto Area. Just think what that means. If you're actually hoping to be someone in your 30s, raising a family in a home that you actually own, you need to start saving in childcare. And until the $10 a day childcare system, childcare costs another rent or mortgage-sized payment. It's more than university tuition. So it's not an easy time to start that saving process. The thing that I want to identify here in a very Alberta-specific way, the fact your line isn't anything like Ontario's or British Columbia's is a massive, massive advantage. Take pride in it, brag about it, say you're better than us because you are on this front, own it, but don't just think it's happening by accident or that it's innately going to remain that way. Nurture it, steward it, demand that your political parties take proactive action now so that we protect it. And that means turn to things that have become relatively common in BC and Alberta, where we're trying to fend the problem after it's already set in. So we do need in Alberta, as I'm sure Carolyn was talking about earlier today in her sessions, thinking about housing as a right. We do need to be thinking about how we are scaling up our non-profit housing sector and building deeply affordable housing in cities and towns throughout this province, and do so now. Get ahead of the game. You're better than these places that are insane, but there are many problems here already. Don't just think the fact you're not the worst means that there's not action to take. But even if we were to double or triple or quadruple the amount of non-market housing available, we'd probably go from like 5% of people, 6% of people accessing non-market housing to 12 or 18 or 24, maybe even the most ambitious would be 40%. You'd still have the majority of Canadians relying on the regular market to make a home. And so we do have to pay very careful attention about the way that the regular housing market now is being used for two purposes: housing for homes, housing as investment strategies. Now, often when I talk about housing as investment strategies, the image that you'll have is like this foreign buyer who's got global amounts of cash and they're wanting to park them in different places in our country. And then they'll often leave homes empty. Or they'll use them as hotels for vacationers rather than people who are living and working and studying locally. And so we do need to think about what are the ways to use public policy to dial down those kinds of harmful demand. We also do need to think a lot about supply and not build the kind of supply that's actually most sexy and attractive to people who are buying extra homes as investments. So many of the new homes built in Ontario and BC are like studio apartments or one bedrooms. Anyone want to raise a family in a studio apartment or one bedroom? Anybody? Like, that's hard. You don't, especially when many of them don't have access to the ground, and you're just like, kids, go play on the balcony. So we need to be thinking about how are we building the right supply. We have lost the idea in Metro Vancouver that family housing is something that has 3 bedrooms. Family housing now gets described as 2 or more bedrooms. So you are going to have, everyone has one child, maybe multiple children in a single bedroom. You never have guests come over unless you put them in the closet. And we are at a moment where we are going to be building generationally large amounts of housing. And to think back to our afternoon plenary session, our building sector is just a dramatic contribution to our carbon emissions. And so we have these opportunities we're building anew to build in the deep energy efficiencies, the net zero homes that are the way of the future. And yet, because there's such an affordability conversation, like, we can't afford to do that right now. We can't afford not to. Once they're built, if we haven't designed them as well as they can be, it's so much more expensive to retrofit them later. So let's make sure that we are building anew with the energy efficiency. And we need to protect renters. Renters, more and more, are the reality for so many younger folks. The dream of home ownership in this country is increasingly out of reach, and yet our public policy often treats renters as second-class neighbors. So we're going to need to upgrade that public policy to ensure that we're protecting renters and we're building more homes for them. These are all the kinds of conversations that I would say are pretty typical now in our housing spaces. They're important, they're critical, there's so much more work to do on them, and yet I think they can oftentimes avoid one of the harder conversations. Why? Why in this country have we tolerated home prices leaving earnings behind so much? And that is because rising home prices aren't uniformly bad. If you're a homeowner like me, rising home prices have given me easy wealth windfalls. Housing for me, I have one home, I own one home on unceded land, and it has made me part of the global 1%, I think, in all honesty. And so there's this tension that even everyday Canadian households have become entangled in the cultural addiction to the idea that rising home values are going to contribute to our wealth accumulation and financial security later in our lives. But there's a mathematical problem built into that. It only works in one moment in time, at one generational moment. And what is giving me wealth windfalls means that anybody in my family who is younger than me, who is just as smart as me, who is just as hardworking as me, can afford less of what I have. And so that means we need to think differently about this place of housing in our own financial planning. And are we open to saying, we imagine an economy in which we hope that home prices will never again rise, at least relative to earnings. This has really big implications for how we grow our economy. This is a depiction of Canada, and I'll show a little bit of an adaptation about what it would more likely look if I gave you Alberta data in a moment. But this is the national data. And it might surprise you in Alberta, where you're very accustomed to fossil fuels sort of driving your economy. But actually, fossil fuels are not the biggest part of the Canadian economy. The biggest part of the Canadian economy is real estate, rental, and leasing, at 14% of our gross domestic product. In my province, it's nearly 20%. Now, that would be wonderful, potentially, if 14 to 20% of Canadians and British Columbians made their livelihoods in those industrial sectors, but that's not what actually happens. Fewer than 2% of Canadians, 2% of British Columbians, and 2% of Albertans make their livelihoods in real estate, rental, and leasing. That is a very, very complicated way to grow an economy in terms of thriving, because here's what it means. We grow our economy by growing the major cost of living so that it gets more and more costly, more and more valuable. For anybody who actually does make their living in that sector, read largely real estate agents, they make very good livings. Owners of property like me enjoy lovely wealth windfalls while I sleep or watch television or cook in the kitchen. Everybody else has their hard work pay off less because their hard work can't earn income that keeps pace with the major cost of living. It's one way to grow an economy, if you think GDP is really the metric of growing an economy. But if we really want thriving, if we want the well-being that Courtney was talking about earlier, we know that a healthy, strong economy is one that's going to require less, not more work to cover our major cost of living, and that is done so in a way that is sustainable socially, economically, and environmentally. Now here in Alberta, I think you do have an advantage. I don't even have, my left-hand side for the chart isn't big enough to show you how big a contribution extraction of fossil fuels is to your economy. It's about 25%, so it's off my chart. Your real estate is about 11%. But notice, even in fossil fuels, you have a relatively modest range of employment. There's like a big gap there. The two things that have big gaps are about extraction. Some groups are extracting a great deal of wealth out of this industry, but it's not going to a large part of the population in terms of their earnings. You see that in no small part in terms of fossil fuel extraction. You definitely see that in real estate. But Alberta now knows it needs to diversify. That was a big part of the election campaign platforms in May. This is a good thing. And as you diversify, please, please, please resist the idea that you want real estate to be the place where you start growing. That is a recipe to just bring damage that we have too much experience with in British Columbia and Ontario. These lines, again, show you the increases in home values over the last several decades by province and then by some regions. And I'll bring it back to this theme of are rising home prices uniformly good or uniformly bad? Neither. For those of us who got into the housing market some decades ago, and my personal story is in 2004, in that top pink line. 2004 was a pretty damn good time to start. It didn't feel that way at the time. It seemed really expensive. I should be buying a castle, and I'm buying what really felt like a teardown. But boy, oh boy, thereafter, it's kind of turned my wealth into like castle-like expectations. But since 1976, across this country, disproportionately in Ontario and BC, the net value in principal residences, so the net value being after the mortgages that people still hold in their home, I have a large one still. After that, still there's over $3 trillion of additional wealth in our homes, 2/3 of which is owned by people over 55. And I draw our attention to that because we often talk about our being in a moment of scarcity. Everybody's struggling with unaffordability. And we get angry at the owners of grocery stores because they're profiteering off the rising food prices. Or we get angry at those who own the gas and whatnot and getting the windfalls from rising energy levels. But then we're a little bit quiet in thinking about who owns the housing in Canada. The housing's not owned disproportionately by some greedy corporate person over there. The housing's owned by everyday, regular Canadian households. And so there are many who have actually been gaining in this moment. And I draw our attention to that because if it isn't entirely a moment of scarcity, we can resist sometimes going to our more inward, nervous, anxious levels where selfishness can come out and we're just trying to make sure we can get our base needs met. If there actually is abundance, we have so many more options to think about how to rise to our higher level aspirations. And if there's one thing that's been producing abundance in this country, we have been printing wealth through real estate. Interestingly, I know Parkland has strong affiliations with union. Anyone who, union movement folks, hands up. Oh, it's a union crowd. Okay. Interestingly, this poses, I think, challenges increasingly for how unions think about inequality. Because housing wealth, especially when it's in principal residences, is relatively sheltered from taxation. So my $1.5 million wealth windfall, with current public policy, I'll likely pay next to no taxes on it ever. Which means that when unions support people to have good paying jobs and their earnings are pretty much entirely subject to income taxation, and then when people go and they take their after-tax earnings and they invest it in a range of things in mutual funds, et cetera, and 50% of their returns are subject to taxation. When I sleep and clean and watch television, I'm not being subject, the windfalls I get are not being subject to taxation. If I were in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, if I was anywhere but Ontario, I'd be annoyed because in many respects, we are enjoying massive tax shelters on wealth that we're getting when we're lucky as homeowners that other provinces aren't experiencing in the same way, and yet we're not adapting our tax policy to just like, hey, maybe we don't need to tax your income as much because we can be taxing these wealth windfalls over here more. So I do think we need a bit of a tax shift conversation. How do we reduce taxes on things that we want more of, like higher earnings, especially for middle and lower income folks, especially for renters, to help their earnings keep pace with the rising levels of rent? And how do we compensate for that by shifting to taxing more what we don't want, like unhealthy home values that are surpassing $1 million and more? So I want to just quickly water ski over a public policy idea that's been created with a range of people, including 2 from Alberta. And I know Lindsay's here. Lindsay McLaren, hands up. Did she have to leave? Oh, darn it. I so wanted to catch up. Anyhow, good Alberta contributions to this idea. We ought to add, just as we have progressivity in our income taxation, we ought to think increasingly about having progressivity in our property taxation. And so one could think about adding, at the moment home values go above $1 million, could we not add a little bit of progressivity there? And here's what it might look like. If you're an owner of a home worth less than $1 million, which is most Albertans, no change would happen. If your home is worth $1.1 million, then there'd be an extra $200 that we might collect through property taxation, provincially or federally. And as that value of your property rises, it will start to go up. I'm more in the $2.5 million range now, so getting closer to $6,500 extra that would be proposing. If you got to be in the top 1% of homeowners in this country in a home that's worth $3 million, that's the top 1%. The extra taxes we'll be talking about, $13,000. If you're a middle earner today on your income, that's what you're paying. It's not really a new idea. Progressivity in taxation isn't new. Property taxation happens in every province, in every city around the country. And we could do it in ways that when people have modest incomes but a lot of housing wealth, that's okay. We already let people defer their property taxes for a range of reasons until the home is sold or until it's inherited. We can continue to do that when thinking about this sort of idea. But it's important because it could raise some serious revenue. Revenue used to build deeply affordable housing, or to offer portable rental benefits, or if it was just more politically sellable, to reduce taxes for low and middle earners, et cetera. But ultimately, it's a way to try and slow down home prices from rising. And it would show those of us who, like me now, are among the top 10% of homeowners in the country in terms of the value of the home. Can we show some allegiance to the Canadian dream that a good home should be in reach for what hard work can earn? Because right now, what's benefiting me is absolutely crushing that dream. Shifting from housing to thinking about what's going on with the generation raising young kids who are struggling with housing right now. And I was struck by the fact that family policy received relatively little attention in the most recent Alberta election. It was an affordability election, but it really didn't dig into like what are the big things that that families need in order to like reduce their costs. And I was further struck by the fact that in the UCP platform, the most generous public investment offered in that platform was to implement too slowly, some progress on $10 a day childcare. And you should know we pay attention at Gen Squeeze to $10 a day childcare because the branding for that, a national recommendation of $10 a day, that started in the Gen Squeeze lab in 2010. So we take real pride that when the feds finally decided to act on this, they took our branding, that childcare shouldn't be another rent or mortgage-sized payment, so we'll make it $10 a day max. And then campaigning, the UCP said, okay, we'll implement some $10 a day childcare. And the entire amount of money they were offering was what they had received from the federal government. I think that's really interesting in the province of Alberta, which likes to pick fights with the feds. But their most generous offer to family in the election campaign was to use federal funds. And I want to be a bit provocative in this moment where Alberta is thinking seriously about following the Quebec model of having its own public pension. I think if you're going to be so bold as to think about having an Alberta pension plan, why stop there? Why not have like an Alberta parental leave plan? Because Quebec has a better parental leave system than anywhere else in Canada, much more generous, much more affordable for families. They're really wanting to support families. They want to reproduce a French-speaking population, so they invest in folks to have kids there. But if you're going to be thinking about having public policy, adopting from other provinces, why not thinking about making it a better parental leave policy here in Alberta? No mention of parental leave whatsoever in the last election's platforms on either side. And when we start to neglect what it takes to sort of address some of the challenges facing the generation raising young children, it brings me into thinking more about what it takes to promote health and well-being. And it's really clear from the science, and I work in the School of Population and Public Health, and I love Courtney so much because Courtney gets that health doesn't begin with medical care. Medical care treats illness. After we have problems, it's remarkably good at kicking into gear. Health begins where we are born, grow, live, work, and age, and that is shaped not only by the ecological issues that Courtney was discussing earlier, but also a range of social and economic issues that shape our incomes and our housing costs and our education opportunities. And those are in turn shaped by systemic power dynamics related to race, class, sex, and so on. But in Canada, we have a tendency to think that health does begin with medical care. So much of our public conversations, and I'm going to show you soon, so much of our budgets focus disproportionately on the medicine side of the equation. And interestingly, that's starting to worry Canadians. More and more, we're starting to think, are we doing so much on treating illness that we're getting out of balance and investing in actually what makes people healthy and keeps them well? And so at Gen Squeeze, we've built a new alliance called Get Well Canada, where we're really wanting to fulfill the promise of Canada's commitment to healthcare and not just medical care. And that means that we understand health is something broader than medical care. It indicates if we don't have access to affordable childcare and good incomes and safe homes and a healthy environment, then no medical care system will ever be enough to prevent people from dying early. The science is clear that if governments really want to promote our health and well-being, then we need to grow spending on social and education issues more urgently than we do on medicine. It is really beyond contestation, that data. But culturally, we have for decades now moved away from that data. Once upon a time, a decade after we'd started our medical care experiments provincially in this country, we still had provinces consistently investing more in social and education benefits and services than we did in medicine. I'm giving you ratios here of the social and education spending relative to medical spending. I don't need us all to do the math other than to know if you see a number bigger than 1 here, it means more to social and education issues. Less than 1, it means more to medicine. And so in the mid-1970s, again, when baby boomers were a younger demographic and whatnot earlier in their life course, we were consistently investing more in those social and education issues. But if you flip forward to today, or the best data are just before the pandemic set in, you'll see that provinces consistently now spend much, much less on social and education issues. Now, this doesn't mean they cut spending on social and education issues. They just didn't grow it as urgently. So for instance, today, after adjusting for inflation, compared to the mid-1970s, social spending in Alberta is about $5 billion more. Education spending is about $8 billion more. Put those together, that adds up to $13 billion. But we've increased medical care spending here by $21 billion. And I'm a person who studies budgets because I think when we put our money somewhere, that really does signal our priorities, much so, more so than our mouths. And when you don't invest to slow the flow of sickness into our medical care system, into our health units, into our emergency rooms, then it is absolutely no coincidence that the cost of medical care will go up, but access doesn't. It's no coincidence that doctors are going to want to say, we need to prescribe more childcare that's affordable and housing that is safe and affordable and a safe environment, but that's not their business. That's not really what they can do, especially if we're not investing it in ways that they can refer patients to. And it's not a coincidence that many medical professionals are going to be burning out, and I think this part might blow some people's minds, even though we have way more doctors today than we ever did. It might surprise people in the room to know that the Canadian Institute for Health Information, the monitor of data about our health system, reports that in Alberta in 1976, there were 128 physicians for every 100,000 residents. There are now 244. That doesn't sound entirely like a physician shortage. Now, it's more complicated than simply counting up the numbers of doctors per capita, but we definitely need to be bringing more nuance to the conversation. And in addition to talking about do we have enough doctors, why not talk more about why the heck is the line of patients so darn long? And so there is growing worry that the evidence I just showed you means that we are losing our balance at investing where health begins and then having to spend more aggressively to treat illness after the fact. And we have a citizenry that's increasingly questioning that, saying, oh, social and medical investments, they're not either or, they're flip sides of the same coin. They're part of the same health system, not just a medical system. And so 8 in 10 are worried that we've neglected that social side for too long. And 8 in 10 are worried that we aren't investing more on the social side and the education side to prevent people from having to show up in our emergency clinics in the first place. Again, because we are in Alberta, and this is such an interesting place for federalism, I will put in a bit of a plug for Ottawa at this moment, as Alberta and all provinces have to some degree been retreating from investing where health begins, on that social and education side. Ottawa has been picking up the slack. In 1976, again, routinely, Ottawa had, if it's a number less than 1, then Ottawa was spending less on social and education issues by comparison with the province. So that was in the mid-70s the case. Now you can see they're typically on par, if not slightly larger. And, well, I know Albertans can be frustrated with Ottawa. It is the case that if you are interested in investments in social and education issues, the determinants of health more generally, that's disproportionately now coming from Ottawa by comparison with your provincial coffers. Oh, we got some federal, we are in Edmonton here. I do know that. This would go over differently in Calgary. This is what your 2023 budget looks like in terms of its projections for spending in 2025. I'm not sure that that's the right balance. It's certainly not supported by health evidence. If you wanted to be investing where health begins, you would not have that medical care side be so much larger than what you're doing for K-12 education, social services, post-secondary, and so on. And if more money for medical care was the secret for better health, then you should be having better health than BC and Ontarians. Because you spend $500 to $600 more per person on medical care in this province than they do in those others. And you do so even though your population is younger on average than those two other provinces, and we know people are more likely to use medical care when they're older. So if I were to adjust it for age, the gap would be even bigger still. But despite spending more on medical care here than other provinces, you were ranked below BC and Ontario, and dare I say the national average for children dying, for heart disease, for deaths due to various kinds of cancer, to the kinds of things that are more chronic diseases appearing later in life. And indeed, you have a lower life expectancy. So rather than take such pride in, how much money are we putting into medical care, we ought to ask, are we spending wisely to actually get better health? And health doesn't begin in our medical care system. One thing you do buy better, you buy really well-paid doctors. The best in the country. And the size of the opportunity to spend differently might surprise you. And I'm not recommending you do this. I'm not suggesting cutting medical care spending in this province. That's not politically saleable, and you would run me out of the room, especially for a range of reasons. But you could, per capita spending on medical care in Alberta would remain on par with BC and Ontario if you spent $2.5 billion less on medical care. And in the years ahead, you're not even planning to spend $2 billion on $10 a day childcare. So there are real trade-offs on this issue. At bottom, it's not about cutting medical care spending now. It's about thinking about the next dollars that are available. And the next dollars that are available, I would urge you to ask your political parties on the left and right of the political spectrum to say, please grow investments where health begins, even more urgently than you're feeling the pressure to grow spending in treating illness after we fall ill or injured. It's the classic wisdom of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. When I think about what happens with regards to spending on medical care out of proportion with what the science would recommend, it then leads into these really interesting intergenerational comparisons. And I want to focus in particular on the degree to which the Alberta budget invests fairly in younger people and older people. And in the current Alberta budget, you are proposing to spend $9,900 per person under 45 and $16,700 per person over 65. Now, we will always spend more at a provincial level on older people because that is the moment in life when we are going to be using more and more medical care. That is a biological reality. We must be planning for it. It will invariably be the case, and if we had even spending between the age groups, that would be a problem. But I do find it interesting that you are the most generous in your investments in an older demographic here by comparison with other provinces, and you have the biggest gap in spending between young and old alike. It's worth asking, why do we have a bigger age gap in spending here than other provinces? You're not necessarily alone. This trend is playing out in a range of ways. I've given some props to the federal level in some of my comments. Now I'll take a little bit of a shot. This is what the 2023 federal budget looks like. It's telling you all the new spending that will be added between now and 2027. And we very intentionally use the elephants as a metaphor in this to be talking about the elephant in the room. And if you just look at one of the elephants, that nice large orange old age security elephant, and a very important public policy, one that my mother relies upon. But growth in the spending on old age security alone is greater than all of the new money that the federal government will spend on employment insurance, supports for families with children, childcare, housing, the clean economy. That does beg some questions about the degree to which there is an intergenerational tension in our budgeting federally and provincially. And to some degree, it reflects that we came up with bad policy decades ago. The hard truth of the matter, and here's one place where I will be provocative for this group, the hard truth of the matter is that in the 1950s and 60s, when we were first designing our old age security and medical care systems, we did not design good revenue plans in order to ensure we collected the revenue needed to pay for healthy retirements for the baby boomers when they got older. Because it was really convenient to say back in the mid-70s when boomers were young adults, hey, there are 7 of us, 7 working age folks to pay for every retiree. That's convenient. I mean, it's just a little bit of money from each of us to go and pay for that retiree to get good outcomes for them. But then, understandably, in retirement now as baby boomer retirees, they want the same, if not better services. That's understandable. But it's happening when there are just 3 working age adults to pay for every retiree. And the thing is, this wasn't news to us. We called it a baby boom for a reason. We knew it was big. We knew that they would go from young to old over time. We knew that we could plan for that, but it was politically expedient not to, because it saved a bit of money for boomers during their working years in terms of taxes. But what it now means is they're expecting their kids and grandchildren to pay markedly more of their tax dollars towards the retirement income and medical care needs of their aging loved ones. And so this is a classic case of a chicken coming home to roost. There was a bad policy chicken some decades ago. We could ignore it, but eventually that chicken did come home to roost, and it's a lousy deal for younger folks. Because the 2023 federal budget alone over the next 4 years projects $132 billion of deficits, even though we are not in recession, 84% of which can be accounted for by the new money for old age security and medical care for those over 65. And as I wind down, thinking about a range of intergenerational tensions that we need to overcome both provincially and federally to make this country work fairly for all generations, let me just touch briefly on the theme of our earlier plenary session, climate change. And whereas I have raised some questions about the UCP platform in the last election, there was a gentleman in the plenary session over here who said in response to Courtney, I don't think adults talk about climate change here. And to some degree, that resonated with me because I want to say, I felt deeply disturbed by the fact that we could do no evaluation of climate policy proposals in the NDP platform because they said next to nothing about it. Next to nothing about the greatest health emergency in the 21st century. And so you've already heard more wisdom on this issue from Courtney and others than I can share, but I do want to remind us that we have extracted so much of the atmosphere's scarce capacity to absorb carbon. It's such a godsend to us. We depend on it. Because for too many decades, our public policy allowed people and businesses to pollute for free or at little cost. The result has been species loss, rising food costs, and extreme weather. And we are now actually taking steps back from what had been historic, recently putting in place a constitutional protection for having a price on pollution so that when we make a mess, we pay to clean it up. But the narrative of affordability to which Generation Squeeze contributes often, we talk about unaffordability all of the time, but we're at this moment where people are like, we can't afford to pay for the mess we're making because it's harder on these other issues right now. But that is a quintessential intergenerational injustice. That is just kicking problems down the road for our kids and grandchildren to deal with. I'm preaching to the choir here. This is not something I think most people in this room are going to be like, oh yeah, I totally, I resist that idea. You get this idea. But if we really want to solve wallet problems, you do that by having better housing policy, as I described, better childcare policy, as I've described, better tuition policy, better retirement pension policy, so that we position ourselves to be able to then deal with the cost of adaptation to new climate risks, the fires, the floodings, the desertification that this province is already experiencing in wildly frightening ways, and also to try and mitigate it from getting worse in the way that Courtney's charts were showing us earlier. We are at this moment where there are absolutely concrete pathways by which to mount to the top of these great places where we want to be. And I've shown you, though, that we have much work to do. And when you think about it, failures to steward our housing system, failures to steward our tax dollars failures to steward our water, soil, and air, these are all symptoms of a broader, broken intergenerational system. They are violating that intergenerational golden rule. They are not having us be good ancestors, stewarding what we hold to be sacred, or planning wisely to invest urgently in well-being from the early years onward. And if we're actually then going to set up the momentum so that we can climb these mountains as urgently as we possibly can, we need to have a stronger foundation that does enshrine into the machinery of government greater commitments to intergenerational fairness and equity. In the BC context, I'm proud to say that Generation Squeeze is now working with the Premier's office there, who has said that he wants to now have reporting in the annual provincial budget that shows how are their spending investments playing out by age. And so rather than Gen Squeeze going into the budget lockup and crunching the numbers really quickly and then hustling to get a little bit of media attention to hopefully have some of the media cycle cover, people, there's a bit of a tension here. The actual documents of government will be starting to use its own machinery to shine a light on it. I hope that that will actually come to fruition as a result of our work with the Deputy Finance Minister by the 2024 budget, and then I hope we can bring that as a model of best practice here and elsewhere. And we have also been working federally, have been fortunate enough to be asked to brief not only the Prime Minister, but his entire cabinet, but it was a bit vexing because they asked us to do it about youth issues. And if you go to the Gen Squeeze website, you will never see the issue of youth issues. Because while I love that we focus on young people, and they desperately need it because their hard work is not paying off, it has very little to do with what young people are doing. And so much more to do with their treatment by past generations as a result of past policy decisions by past governments. And those past policy decisions are giving rise to problems now that were predictable then. This is the classic chicken coming home to roost. And so we have called for the federal government to launch a federal task force on generational fairness, which we think can advance many of the sorts of goals that I described for you today. I was in the Prime Minister's office multiple times this week trying to see if we can get that over the line. Not quite yet, but stay tuned, we're still working on it. And I think here in Alberta, I hope that regardless of what party you have affiliation with, and unions, I encourage you to do this. Unions could help lead new commitments to generational fairness by saying, in the platforms going forward, we need a minister responsible for generational fairness. We need to build an advisory body who gives good expert advice to that minister, and we need a whole of government bureaucratic secretarial support to actually weave that through every department that's going on in the government level. And so I ask you to join forces with us in trying to bring about those systemic changes in the machinery of government so we can then win the policy victories that I described to address the symptoms of generational unfairness. If you don't know about Generation Squeeze already, check us out at gensqueeze.ca and think about clicking on that join button because our power to influence public policy grows with the size of our network. and contribute to attracting more people to join forces with us by sharing our fabulous videos and podcasts for your enjoyment and listening pleasure. One of the things I'm most interested in right now, from young and especially old alike, we have a space on our website where you could go and share your story about why you care about generational fairness. We need to socialize that more than we have in the past. I mean, I think it's common now to talk about colonialism and sexism and classism and heterosexism and racism. But this ism around a broken systemic generational system is newer to us. And so having people share their stories so that we can then use that to socialize our politicians is a big part of our theories of change. I'm looking forward to our dialogue, which I will get to in just moments, but it's not a one-time thing. Most of the dialogue with Jen Squeeze happens, we're Twitter skeptics now, I'm sorry, and you know, young folks really aren't on Facebook. So we're hanging out in Substack, we invite you to join us there. We're trying to grow the dialogue in that new social space. Because at bottom, our goal is to preserve Canada's standing as one of the greatest countries on earth. We are in the top 5 for growing old, as ranked by Global Age Watch. And we want to address the very vexing reality that UNICEF consistently ranks us as one of the worst countries, rich countries in the world in terms of investing in children, youth, and their parents. I want to bind together the ambition to be excellent on both of these issues because that is how we make this country and this province work fairly for all generations, and that is the world that I hope we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kershaw. So we're going to go to the lady in the mask right over here to ask the first question.
Not very long ago, my 21-year-old came to me and said, I made a huge financial mistake, Mom. And I thought, what big mistake could he have made? Because I know all his finances. And he said, I didn't buy a house in kindergarten.
He's a Jen Squeezer. Love him.
Absolutely. And so I have him. I have an older child with existential dread about the climate change. It impacts every day how he feels about what his life is going to be like. So my biggest question is I could not write fast enough to catch everything. Is all that information on your webpage, like all of those resources we can find? Because
all of the resources you can find pretty much at those 3 links I gave on the one slide.
Has your organization made any attempt to quantify the enormous debt we're leaving in Alberta to future generations due to the mess left behind by the fossil industry?
Yeah, we haven't specifically, but there are other organizations that are, have been putting dollar values to that. The mess is both a dollar issue. We know, for instance, from the Canadian Climate Institute, Courtney can probably talk about these things better than I can, but we just know that the debt grows every moment we're slow to act. Like the costs of acting more down the road are so much greater than doing it now, both on the adaptation side and on the mitigation side. And so we're already feeling the costs of climate change. It's costing our economy already billions. And the problem is, if we don't act now, then those billions become amplified by magnitudes of order. And so it's one thing about the debt that's already being left as a result of the abandoned wells, et cetera. But it's the very little capacity left in the atmosphere to absorb carbon that's the especially precious commodity that we now need to protect. And so I think others wiser and better on this particular issue can give you a concrete answer. Courtney, maybe help me. Do you know the answer? Canadian Climate Institute, go there. They do this really well. Damage control is a great report. They really do it at a pan-Canadian level, give us some great numbers to just show the economic costs we've already incurred and the costs of inaction going forward, or slow action.
Yeah, just quickly, some of the biggest numbers are from Alberta, and so it's worth going and looking up those numbers and knowing them, because it's like 5 billion here, 3 billion here, 5 billion here, it adds up fast.
I know that Corey Longo, who was here earlier, when she ran for city council in Edmonton, she was talking about progressive taxation of housing, like you mentioned. And I wondered if you had done any review of municipal politicians that are proposing this, or any supports for municipal politicians who might want to support it.
Great question. I mean, the short answer that I'd give is we tend not to focus on the municipal level because I don't actually think this is that's the right level of government to implement it at. Because if you do it in one municipality, then you have a neighboring one not doing it, you're going to actually create a range of problematic incentives. But provinces can do it. and or the federal level. So we've been focusing on that front. This is a big shift. This is not an easy political win. And so we pick and choose our moments to push it. I think that the municipal level is not the primary place, although I'm so proud of some municipal politicians who talk about wanting to add that progressivity. That just, I think, helps pave the way for us to bring it to the appropriate level of government.
Comment on your per capita calculations of healthcare expenses.
Oh, great.
If you redo the calculation, take out the cost of reorganization.
Yeah, I suspect that doesn't entirely change the numbers, but I take your point and I laugh along with you.
Thank you. I'd like to circle back a little bit to some of your data about housing prices and how they have expanded far beyond people's ability to pay for them. Some of your graphs, you had national averages, then you had provincial averages, and you had some regional trends with some of the outlier communities like GTA and Vancouver area. But I haven't seen any good data recently that filters those outlier areas out of those averages to show what it looks like in smaller centers and provinces where that's not an issue.
Yeah, so you can go to gensqueeze.ca, click on Get Informed, click on Housing, and then you can find our most recent Straddling the Gap report. I think it's from 2022. And there you will find these line graphs for every province. I think we do the territories, Courtney. I think we do the territories. And then cities in most of those regions as well. So that takes it out. And you're right, the Canadian average is absolutely shaped by those BC and Ontario quote-unquote outliers. That's a huge chunk. Effectively, you put BC, Ontario, and Alberta together, you've got, I think that's 90% of English Canada. So those three regions are a big part of what's most Canadians are experiencing, but I completely take your point. No matter what all the data show clearly, housing affordability has eroded. It takes more work for a younger demographic to try and get into home ownership. The home ownership rates for younger folks are on the decline, and their consolation prize, so friggin' good, they get to pay rising rents.
You mentioned your wealth
Yes.
in your property.
Yeah.
But isn't that only when you sell?
I
what
love
I mean
this
by that,
question.
Yeah, okay, so
I love this
there was
question.
the real estate bubble in the States, and a lot of properties went underwater.
Yep.
And then like in Florida, properties are literally going underwater, and they won't be able to sell them and get money back. So a lot of wealth that people think they might have may not actually happen. I understand also in Ontario, a lot of, with COVID, people bought cottages outside of Toronto, and now they're stuck with big debts, and they can't pay those, and they can't sell them.
Yeah. So the punchline here is it real wealth? Yes. If I had $1 for every time I was asked that question, I wouldn't need my friggin' home to make me wealthy. I actually worry a lot about my home getting underwater in reality because of the river I live next to, and even though I'm 37 kilometers from the ocean, as sea levels rise, I think the Fraser River will actually start to go over my home. So I do worry a little bit about, how long is that really such a good asset? That thinking can play with regards to any stock one owns. It says, one cannot predict the future. Just talk to people who own BlackBerry. But here's the reality. I challenge any of you to watch the CTV or CBC 24-hour news programs. And you will not be able to get away from two companies doing commercials in every commercial break. One is a CHIP home income plan, and one is Equitable Bank. And they are absolutely realists about this, and there are entire industries now that allow us to tap into the equity in our homes without having to move away. They're called home equity lines of credit. And so you'll have the CHIP home income plan have this lovely, in this case, older white couple. They're talking about how they are so happy they get to stay in their home, and they're gonna tap into the wealth they have, and the husband asks the wife, should we get a hot tub, inside or out? Wife responds, why not both? Because there's that much affluence there. Or even better yet, so the Equitable Bank has come into this space now, and it has this commercial, again, an older white woman right now, she's out watering her garden. It's kind of singing. And what interestingly happens is her house starts singing. And the punchline of the house is like, we can have caviar, and we can have this. And the punchline says, when your house is rich, so are you. And that, I think, is absolutely right on the nose. It's real wealth, and I use my own personal story once again to make that clear. I have borrowed against my home and invested 6 figures in the stock market. I have borrowed against my home, and I have an electric vehicle and solar panels which eliminate my energy costs. I have borrowed against my home and made some nice improvements. I have been able to tap into that wealth while remaining there. It is absolutely real wealth, and their entire industry is enabling us to do that. And when we suggest it is not real wealth, that is the ability of power to try and perpetuate the inequalities that exist by suggesting it's not real wealth. Well done. And so I ask you this, can I? Okay, a little thought experiment. We've done polling on this, so I know generally what the Canadians think. But this matters for the unions in the room. Unions run a really good class analysis, and I would provoke you to think that increasingly it needs refinement. Because imagine, do you think the following person is rich or poor? A widow with a $25,000 income, rich or poor? Yeah, when I just give you that information, people's initial instinct, because we focus on income a lot, like, oh, that person's not very affluent. Now she lives in Hamilton, Ontario, and her house is worth more than $1 million, and she owns it outright. Rich or poor? Rich. $2 million. Rich for sure. So I've got you rich at $1 million, and some people in Vancouver wouldn't say so much. Think about a young lawyer. She earns $200,000. That puts her in the top few percentile of earners in this country. Is she rich or poor? Rich. Sounds rich to me. She's a renter. Can't afford more than a 2-bedroom place. And so what's driving inequality, what's transforming class is wealth, and the most common kind of wealth is our home equity. The middle class is being hollowed out, but in 2 directions. A younger demographic, even with good earnings and good education and good jobs, is increasingly not getting the experience of the middle class in terms of the security of secure housing and tenure. An older demographic, myself included, are being pushed out of the, leaving the middle class, not pushed out, transcending from the middle class into the most affluent. Yes, transcending. But our affluence is being gained at the cost of the unaffordability for those who follow. That's what's driving class dynamics right now. And if we don't have unions pick up that we need to do so much more than just measure incomes, God, what's going on here? If we don't do more than measure incomes, then the class analysis of the union is actually getting stale and outdated. And you would be surprised how often we have young people in unions saying, can you lobby our union to have a better analysis?
Awesome. Okay, it looks like we have one last question right here up front.
Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of interest rates in the housing market. And in effect, the big prices of homes are partly a reflection of the net present value or the low interest rates. So my question is, your analysis generally looks at the amount of time you need to save for a down payment. However, another way of looking at it is with the low interest rates over the last 20 years, the debt service ratio has also compensated for that. And the other issue is that you also have an effect on the savings class, which is instead of 15% interest rates, they were getting 2 or 3%. So just your reflections on that.
This is another question that could make me affluent if I got $1 every time it was asked. So if you think about some of those line graphs that I described earlier, going from the 70s to the contemporary context, there was a pink line. The pink line was showing interest rates. And there's this interesting sort of association, and I have to say it's an association between, as interest rates go down, home prices are rising. You're right, in the early 1980s, there was a moment when the cost of servicing a mortgage for the average value of a home rivaled the cost of servicing a mortgage in 2019 for an average priced home. Even though we had record low interest rates really in 2019, and we had very high interest rates in 1982. The difference was the average price home was a fraction of the average price home in the decades now. So high interest rates on a low value weren't really that different than remarkably low interest rates on a frighteningly high value. But here's the deal. Statistics Canada is actually really letting us down on this, right? Statistics Canada has had a generational inequity built into its measure of the CPI, and this matters. StatsCan does many, many measurements. I use it all the time as an academic. but I kind of think like Lord of the Rings. Like there's sometimes like one indicator to rule them all. And I often think that inflation, or the measure of the CPI, Consumer Price Index, is that indicator, because the CPI determines what our Bank of Canada will do with regards to monetary policy. And its responsibilities are to keep inflation below, we all should probably know the number, what's our target, people? 2%-ish, exactly. But then what gets told to them is 2% depends on what StatsCan measures. And StatsCan's measurement of housing inflation is outdated. It might surprise you to know that when they measure housing inflation from the standpoint of home ownership, they don't actually track how much does one need to save as a down payment. They don't actually measure how much after you've got a down payment do you then need to borrow to cover the rest of your mortgage. What they measure from the standpoint of home ownership is actually from the perspective of someone who's already in the market, as an owner, how much interest are you paying on what you've borrowed? And so they build in this mathematical oddity that as interest rates go down, it looks like housing is becoming more affordable. But that misses what actually happens in the economy. When interest gets cheap and we can borrow cheaply, what do Canadians do? We borrow large sums of money. Do we invest in new green technologies? No, I already showed you what our GDP does. We bring it into bidding up the price of housing. And I don't mean just getting money and building housing that doesn't exist. I mean bidding up the price of what already exists. And so the Canadian Real Estate Association shows that after 2000, average home prices in this country have gone up over 300%. They report that inflation was less than 50. They know that housing is a major cost of living. If there's that big mismatch between overall inflation, I know there's things like food and energy costs and whatnot, but they're modest by comparison with our shelter. And if our CPI is actually mismeasuring, it's giving the wrong signals to the Bank of Canada, and there is a darker side to cheap credit. Cheap borrowing, you bid up the price of housing. StatsCan doesn't measure that. The housing value is going up in their measure of housing inflation, so they give the wrong signals to the Bank of Canada. They kept interest rates historically low. And so we kept doing it in this vicious cycle. Imagine we actually had signaled in 2005, 2009, 2012, 2015 that we had housing inflation in the way we really did, and we had one rate hike, every few years, as opposed to 10 rate hikes in a matter of a year and a half. 10 rate hikes in a matter of a year and a half because energy and food costs went up is crushing people. Having better signals spread over a decade and a half would have allowed us all to adapt and would have likely kept home prices markedly lower than they are now. Because StatsCan is giving the wrong signals. They're mismeasuring housing inflation. It's actually, in this case, it's a wonkish measurement problem, and it's hard to change their minds on it. I will tell you, we work with people at the Conference Board of Canada, the Business Council of BC, and little old Jen Squeeze. And we go and take meetings with the senior people at StatsCan, trying to get them to adjust. But it's slow progress. I think we are almost at a time.
We are, and I just want to thank you all so much for the thought-provoking conversations. I know there's lots of questions still in the room. So on behalf of the Parkland Institute, I'd really like to thank Dr. Kershaw for his passion, the work you're doing, and the wonderful talk that you've given us all today. And I'd like everyone to just give one more round of applause and get home safe.
Thank you very much.